Madam Chair, colleagues, the concern I have on this item is I guess you'd call it the couplet, Bush and Pine Street, which I think most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. It's a very high volume set of streets. It's one way. As far as I know, it's designed essentially to move large volumes of traffic from the avenues downtown and vice versa. It's quite congested in the peaks in the direction when the peak is pronounced. And just on the face of it, and I would like to ask staff to provide some additional detail on the proposal, but just on the face of it, reducing the speed limit on those roads to the same speed limit that's in front of my house just seems out of whack to me. And, you know, currently, I believe the lights on those two streets are synchronized so that we don't have a speeding problem on the street for the most part, because the lights basically teach you to travel at a certain speed, just like they do on other major thoroughfares in the city. But Bush and Pine move such high volumes of traffic, I worry that all we're doing is just adding a couple minutes to people's trip. And I don't know what we're really getting for it. So if there is from the staff a report on the thinking behind it, I think I understand the other streets that are part of the proposal, but these two, it seems to me, especially given their one-way nature and their sort of citywide importance, are a different kettle of fish.
And maybe you can talk about, I know that there's also, staff is looking at lowering speed limits in other areas, maybe like in front of his house.
We'd love to lower that speed limit. Tom McGuire, Sustainable Streets Director again. So just a little context here. The California Vehicle Code requires us, anywhere we post a speed limit that we want to enforce with radar, that we periodically do a radar speed survey. So our engineering team has gone out, surveyed a large number of streets, many more than are listed in today's agenda, and found that these are streets where the current 85th percentile speed justifies lowering the speed limit from whatever it's posted today to a lower speed limit. In the case of Pine and Bush, it has historically been posted at 30. You can lower it to 25 based on the speeds we've seen. These are both high injury network streets in our Vision Zero network, and the goal of this change and most of our speed limit reductions around the city is not so much about the speed of traffic when the road is congested during peak periods, but rather to knock down those top-end speeds. As I think hopefully you've heard me say this enough, it's those high-end excessive speeds that are disproportionately the cause of so many crashes on our streets. So this is primarily a safety measure, and it's primarily about reducing, again, not making somebody drive, 24 instead of 25 miles an hour, but knocking down those speeds where people are driving in excess of 40 and 50 miles an hour, which are data points we saw during our surveys. And again, a reminder that while these streets do carry a lot of traffic, there are schools on these streets, there are tourist distractions on these streets. They go through some very congested commercial areas. So working within the very constraints of the California Vehicle Code, these are opportunities to use speed limit policy to supplement what we've already done with the traffic signals to knock down those high-end speeds.
I'd also like to point out that Pine and Bush are residential streets, with the exception of a handful of blocks in the financial district. It's all houses along both streets. And those were streets that used to simply have one lane in each direction until in the 1930s, the sidewalks were narrowed in order to accommodate 3 lanes of one-way car traffic. So our goal on streets like Pine and Bush is to continue to accommodate the car traffic, but to do so in a speed that is closer to the design tolerance of the human body. The force of impact in a crash varies by half the mass of the objects involved times the square of their velocity. So in safety science, the square of the velocity is the most important part of the equation. If we can bring speeds down to 25, we can dramatically reduce the severity of injuries. If we brought speeds down to 14 or 12, we could eliminate fatalities on Pine and Bush.
Well, and I suppose we could do that citywide and declare it a job well done. But I don't think that makes sense in trying to put together a balanced policy that I think needs to be respectful and protective of all modes, not just the mode of the week. So maybe I could ask a question on the high injury network. I mean, these streets are miles long. I mean, so are you telling me the entire length of both streets is on the high injury network?
Well, the methodology we use to create the high injury network does take into account that crashes, even fatal crashes, and fatal and high injury crashes are relatively infrequent. So when we map out the high injury network, we don't say, these 3 blocks are on, but the 2 blocks in between them are off. There is some data smoothing
You
across
do
the
have a
corridor.
map of it, though, right?
We do have a map of
And
it, yeah.
on that map, are the lengths of the streets that are being proposed to be affected here, are they on that map? Or is it smaller segments of them?
Pine and Bush are on that map, at least as far as Van Ness. I'm sorry, I don't have the map in front of
Okay,
me.
okay.
But yeah, that's right.
Well, look, I guess I'm still unconvinced. And if we're not able to distinguish among streets in the city, then maybe they all ought to have the same speed limit. But the fact that we have different speed limits for different streets is an indication that those streets perform different functions, they're engineered differently. I mean, for example, one-way streets eliminate a lot of the turbulence that you have in two-way streets, right? Left turn lanes and all the rest of it. So it seems to me if we've got a street that is functioning as designed, Tom, could you tell us where the actual speed is, what the prevailing speed is that makes you confident that you can reduce the speed limit?
So the 85th percentile speed on the street, we did divide it into 2 segments. I'm sorry, I'm pulling out the data that our staff prepared. So we separate the street at Van Ness. So on both sides of Van Ness Avenue, for instance, Pine Street, the 85th percentile speed, which is not the fastest speed in the street, was over 30 miles an hour. It was 33 miles an hour actually on both segments in the before survey. Now we've actually modified the traffic signals. We've already done some engineering things here. We're really asking you to make a legal cleanup to something that we've already taken steps to fix. We retimed all the signals north of Market. We were able to use signal timing to reduce that top speed from 33 to 30 miles an hour on both sides of Van Ness. At this point, that means that it would be legally appropriate, and again, this board's been asking us to take aggressive stance on speed limit for years. It is finally legally appropriate for us to take the next step to move it from 30 to 25. We couldn't put a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit sign on a street where the 85th percentile vehicle is moving 33 miles an hour under the vehicle code.
And so is the practical way that you would implement this change that you would go back and retime the lights so that they're at 25 instead of 30?
So we actually retimed the lights in November.
Right.
And again, our position is that the posted speed limit and even the signal progression shouldn't affect end-to-end running time because we're still giving a very generous window of green time to the east-west traffic on these streets because of their role in the traffic network.
But to the extent that the actual speed was out of whack with the limit, which is 30 presently, you've addressed that problem, haven't you, with the retiming of the signals?
We've addressed the problem of moving the 85th percentile speed down, which is good news.
Right.
We want to make sure that SFPD has the enforcement tools to address those 40 and 50 mile an hour speeders.
Well, but that's a problem under either case, right? Whether the speed limit's 25 or 30, if someone's going 40 or 45, they're breaking the law.
So it's a problem under either case, though. To Jeff's point, the farther you get up in the high end speed, the more danger you're causing. Likewise, under California Vehicle Code, the larger the gap between your speed and the posted speed limit, the greater the penalty. So there's a real deterrent effect.
And look, I fully buy into the argument that the lower the speed, the less likely that the conflict, when it occurs, is going to be fatal or involve a serious injury. But I'm still, and I'll subside on this point, I'm still concerned that we seem to be blurring the distinction of all roads in the city and county of San Francisco. And the fact is, some roads are higher volume and should have higher speeds than others. And these two, if they don't make that cut, I really don't know who does.
Okay. Well,
Director Brinkman.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you bringing this up, Mr. Heminger. I feel like I can speak for Pine Street. I lived on Pine Street for 7 years in the residential stretch. And Mr. McGuire, can you talk about when we are successful in lowering those speed limits? We all know about the safety benefits that come along. The higher speed crashes are much more deadly to pedestrians and cyclists. But what about the noise? One of the things that really hit us living on Pine Street was, honestly, during rush hour, we abandoned the front of the flat. We were just in the back because you couldn't even talk in the front room of our old Victorian flat because the traffic noise going by was so loud. Have we seen that lowering the speed limits also reduces the noise on those streets?
So we don't measure before and after on these particular streets, but consistently the complaints that we get about streets like Pine and Bush and Turk and Golden Gate, and you could imagine any other number of pairs of streets in the city, is the pedestrian environment, the noise, the air pollution, the honking, the quality of life issues. We get far more complaints about that than we do about whether the traffic is moving at 30 or 32 miles an hour.
Right. And so I know living on Pine Street, the front of our building, our plants out front, disgusting with all the car soot on them. It was really nasty. I know lowering the speeds won't necessarily help that. Thankfully, cleaner internal combustion engines and more electric cars are helping that. But I feel like we owe it to everybody who lives on those streets, not just the people biking and walking and the other drivers, but we do owe it to them to lower the speed limits kind of as much as we can. And I see your point that, yes, those are what we would consider traffic streets. They're arterials. But people have a lot of choices on their streets. And if we decide to make winner and loser streets like that, and we just decide, all right, that's going to be, if you live on that street, it's going to be loud, it's going to be fast, it's going to be unpleasant to live on. I'm reminded of the Appleyard study that showed the higher volume and speed of traffic on a street meant you had fewer connections, not just across the street, but next door. And my 7 years on Pine Street, I knew everybody on my side of the block. I knew one person on the other side of the block because the street was just such a dividing line. And anything we can do to help make every neighborhood a pleasant place to live, I think we owe it to the citizens to do it. So I'm absolutely supportive of this. But I really appreciate your bringing it up because it's great to have this discussion and remind all of ourselves why we're trying to slow the speeds on the streets in San Francisco. So motion to approve.
Second?
Second.
Any other discussion, directors? I will say that obviously that all these things, it really comes down to enforcement, right? Making sure that we have the enforcement necessary. I would say that most people probably don't actually know the posted speed limits around the streets of San Francisco, and I think this is actually a great way for people to start paying attention because I honestly didn't know what the speed limit was on the street and probably couldn't tell you what it is on Mission Street where I live. So with that, all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Just Director Heminger? Any other abstentions?
I could see it lowered to 15, quite frankly.
Okay, motion passes. Move on to our next item.